let's start the debate. So the Digital Market Act is designated to regulate the leading digital platforms. And it comes with a series of ex-ante regulatory measures. The objective of the roundtable is to discuss and evaluate the impact of such measures on the development of digital startups in Europe. So let's start with you, Pierre. So your recent note on digital platform contributes to the debate on regulation by providing an analysis of the state of competition and the structure of the markets on which a digital platform operates. For you, if I'm correct, the platform size is not a sufficient criterion to assess market competition. Your note also discuss how the regulation of platforms can pose a risk to consumer welfare, competition, and innovation. So, Pierre, how do you foresee the potential impact of the DMA on these three fundamental elements that are consumer welfare, competition, and innovation? So, you have the floor for about 10 minutes, Pierre.
Okay, thank you. I'll be very quick. In fact, just giving the most important conclusion of the recent note that we have published. First, the first problem to me with these two regulations is that they really, as you say, focus mostly on the size of the platforms to consider that they are powerful or not, or that they can just dominate a market or not, which is very, very tricky when you look at the digital economy, and especially when you look at platforms themselves. As normally when you want to regulate big companies, this is because they could capture consumers or they could harm consumers, especially due to the fact that when you are big enough and when you just are in a monopolistic position, then what you should do normally, what you could do is just increasing your prices, just reduce innovation and provide a lower quality to the people. But what happens with platforms is exactly the opposite. The reason why you are big is that because people are willing to use your platform. And at some point, if you look at the digital economy today, it's impossible just looking at the size, the market shares, or the turnover of the company to say that they are harming the consumers. So here, the very economic logic of this regulation is, in my opinion, very misleading and might be dangerous because it's not a kind of rent-seeking monopolies that we are facing, but they are monopolists that, they are big companies that just earn their size and their power due to the merits, due to the benefits they are providing to consumers. So here, in my opinion, the problem is that we do not focus enough on what is the impact on consumers today and what should we do in order to protect the consumers. In my opinion, if we just try to prevent companies to get bigger, whereas this is exactly the very nature of the digital economy, to have network effects that tend to make big companies bigger and bigger, then we will harm the people we try to protect. And this is my first problem here. The second problem related to the size of companies is that it's very difficult to even define precisely what kind of market we are talking about. Because when you say that a company is controlling the market, you have to be able to define this very market. And here, this is very difficult. What we observed in the note is that it's very difficult, for instance, to say that Amazon is a monopoly. Because at some point, Amazon is just competing with a lot of other platforms that are just providing retail services, but even with Facebook. If you look at Amazon Prime, then Amazon Prime is just is competing with YouTube and is competing also with Netflix and so on. And so because of these economies of scope that exist in the digital economy, it's very difficult to understand and to precisely define what is the real size of the company and whether this company is alone or not, or is in a monopolistic position or not. And then the other point, and I will end up with this, but the other point is that even if we consider that these big companies are in a monopolistic position or have some power, being willing to implement an ex-ante regulation is something that, again, is very tricky and pose some very specific and big risks, especially the fact that if you have an ex-ante regulation that is focusing only on big companies, you are sending a signal to other companies that should not get bigger. And this is a problem here, because if you have small startups that just aim at becoming bigger and bigger, in fact, here they will stop. There is a threshold that you should not go further, and you should not try to get bigger. So you should not please the consumers or the users. You should not try to innovate more, because if you do this and if you are successful, then you will attract people and you will end up in this blacklist. So what you are doing, in fact, is in trying to protect and to promote competition, you are in fact promoting the status quo, where you have already the big companies that you try to regulate. But the big problem is you won't promote more competition. You won't incentivize small companies to get bigger. So by the end of the day, in fact, what you are trying to do is fighting against the GAFA, but protecting the GAFA. And this is an issue here, especially as far as European companies are concerned, because we won't be able to create big companies with this. Here, this is for me the big problem with this regulation, this ex-ante approach that provide a kind of arbitrary power, because no matter what Thierry Breton explained this morning, in fact, you have some arbitrary power to define what is risky or not. For instance, there is this statement, I don't know if in the final report, in the final regulation, it will be written or not, but you have this statement that you can consider that a company will just try to get a monopoly, an abuse of, it's just, they call it, I think, a monopolization abuse or something like this. So if a company is trying to implement a strategy that just is likely to make it gain a monopolistic position, then the companies will be prevented to implement this strategy. But this is crazy, because it means that, in fact, any kind of potentially successful strategy that is something that is business, from a business point of view, that is relevant, will be likely to be prevented by the regulator. So what you are trying to do is, in fact, preventing companies from being efficient, from meeting the demand and satisfying the users. And I'm not sure that with this kind of regulation, we'll be able to promote some efficient ecosystem in Europe. So that's the reason why I'm really skeptical with this, these two DMA, DSA component of the regulation.
Thanks, Pierre. Before giving the floor to the other speakers, I have another question. In your paper and with your economist background, do you have tools to measure the impact or the expected impact of the DMA? Is it possible to, in particular, so on these notions of innovation, on consumer welfare, on investment? So do you have some ways to assess that quantitatively?
There should be some ways, but we would need to have a lot of interviews especially with capital riskers, investors, but also looking at each and every different big companies today, and especially in what kind of business they are doing, because they are so different that it's difficult to provide a general conclusion here. So this is the job we haven't done. But for instance, in another field that I work on, in the environment protection, we observe that in France, we have implemented some specific regulation, some ex-ante regulation that target especially the riskiest companies. And this is something that is absolutely legitimate, because you want to prevent big harm to the society and so on. So you want to prevent technological accident. But what we have observed is that it has also created it has stopped the competitive process in France, because a lot of small companies do not want to be subject to these very stringent norms and standards that exist for the riskiest companies. So that, in fact, again, you create this kind of threshold. If you're already big, then you will have to comply with this. But if you are small, you do not want to do this. So that's what may happen here. And that's the reason why, again, I think it's bad, because it's not helping small companies to get bigger or to try to just gain some market share. So I do not know how much it will cost. But one thing for sure is, if you just reduce the incentive for the people to innovate, then there will be some innovation that European consumers will not benefit from. They will have to go to other places to get some new innovation, both from big companies, but also for small ones who are just producing today new stuff that we do not even imagine. And this is for me quite bad, because of course, I'm living in Europe, and I do not want to be jealous of American people or Chinese people that are benefiting from new innovations that I cannot get.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Thanks, Pierre. Sorry. Thanks, Pierre. It's useful to have your views, and I think it's good also to note that cooperation with, you mentioned a survey of VCs, so cooperation between economists, VCs, and probably startups are very useful. So we have a relevant panel tonight. Then let me turn to you, Melissa. So there is a very clear FAQ on your website, on the Elite for Startup website, on the DMA. And if I read it, you notably mention on your website so about the impact of the DMA on startup ecosystem. So you mentioned on your website, the Digital Market Act has the potential to open more doors to innovation by establishing clear and updated rules for competition within European digital markets. However, these new rules should not dissuade startups from starting or scaling up in the EU in the first place. You added that the platform economy is highly interconnected and platform startups rely on the bigger platform to start their business rapidly and to reach out easily to consumers. So for your members, for startups, there are pros and cons of the DMA. So can you tell us more on these pros and cons? Thank you.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me be a part of this conversation. It's really a lot, means a lot to me to be here because actually I'm on this call with Emanuele, who was on the board of France Digital when I founded Allied for Startups. So I will just back up for those of you who don't know what Allied for Startups is, though I do see some members of our ecosystem family. Hi, Imogen from France Digital, nice to see you. And we are a global network of 45 startup organizations like France Digital at the national level who are focused on creating a better policy environment for startups. So essentially we serve as the voice of startups in politics and government. And we were founded in 2014 at France Digital Day. And our mandate is really driven by our members. So each year our members vote on what matters most to them and we pursue those policy measures. And this year our members voted, of course, to talk about platform legislation as we saw the DSA evolve. And initially, we were only going to focus on the DSA because we assumed that that would be the most relevant for our members. But as the DMA has evolved, what was targeted as something that would really only impact large companies is further revealing to us that it will have a real impact on the ecosystem as a whole. So we have started to get involved in looking at what this is going to mean for our membership. And I want to be really clear because, as you have mentioned, the DSA and DMA formally are released tomorrow. So at this point, we are all operating only based on assessment leaks. So we don't know for sure what is going to be in the DMA, and we can't put out a final verdict. But with that in mind, and knowing that we have also sent a consultation to all of our members, I do want to make a couple of key points, high-level points about what's at stake with regards to a competition instrument at the European Commission level. So the first thing I want to point out is that we're operating from a great place in the European tech ecosystem. The State of European Tech report came out last week, and we are now aware that there are 10,000 platform startups in Europe. It's larger and more competitive than it's ever been year on year. So this is really exciting that we're starting this regulation from a point of knowing what we're doing is working. The second point I want to make, and I definitely want to thank Pierre for following through on this and making the point more from an economic standpoint, is that fundamentally, it's really critical that we don't create thresholds for startups because, as Pierre mentioned so eloquently, we don't want to encourage our startups to stay small because then they can't grow and scale. And actually, I do have a little bit of a bone to pick with the European Commission about this because recently, Commissioner Vestager was interviewed for the Financial Times, and when she was speaking about the DMA, she said that she was going to target not only big tech, but also companies that are high growth or with growth potential. For us, that is the last thing we want to see because we don't want to discourage European startups from scaling and becoming unicorns. That's the main goal here, is that the ecosystem itself in the EU will thrive. The third point I really want to share is what's coming from our member consultation. So as I mentioned, we have sent our consultation out to all of our 45 members to hear what they say. So far, this is the first time essentially in our history as an organization, that our membership has been so divided. I think that's for a variety of reasons. The first is that I feel that we all agree in the ecosystem that it's time for some responsible regulation of big tech. However, that shouldn't be at the cost of startups. And the one main issue that we've seen that everyone does agree on this piece of legislation is that we really cannot interfere with the acquisition processes for startups. There's a lot of language in the DMA which mentions potential for limits on acquisitions and who can buy what company. The problem with that is we all know that startups are created to scale and build and have opportunities for exits. They have no opportunities for exits in Europe. We're not going to see a lot of investments in startups in Europe. So that brings me to the next point, which is critical for this group, and I think really the topic of the conversation around how is this DMA going to impact investment here in Europe. So I have a couple of key thoughts on this as well. One thing that is really important, as I mentioned before, is that we are operating from a place of our ecosystem doing really well, 10,000 scale-ups in Europe. That's great. So we actually saw this year, again, 40 billion euros raised in the European tech ecosystem, even in a year of COVID. So at some level, we can see that there is an investment landscape that is improving. So we need to be really careful to avoid unintended consequences here and create an environment that would not work for investors. For example, if we're going to regulate platforms, what does that mean for an app like TicketSwap, which builds on users having wallets in their iPhones that come from platforms like Apple? The second point I want to make, and I'm sure, at least I hope Emanuele would agree with me, that it's really important and critical for investors to have regulatory certainty when they're making decisions about an investment. Yes, we should create some regulatory landscape that makes sense. It's high time that we think about what we're going to do to make a level playing field, but we can't be changing it with small complications and confusing sub-language. It needs to be really clear what these rules mean, and they cannot impede startups from being able to grow. Which brings me to an important point. We also at Allied for Startups did an assessment of VCs across Europe. We actually talked to 160 EU investors. And here in France, 81% of French investors agreed more could be done by governments to create an environment where tech startups and scale-ups can thrive. So yes, we need to do more. We do need regulation. However, 74% of French investors agreed the principle of designing policy or legislation in order to target specific companies, like the large GAFAs that we were talking about, could lead to poor outcomes that inadvertently hurt or hinder tech startups. So there are a couple of things that need to be done here. We have to think about our competition policy from a framework that is, yes, there's work that needs to be done to level the playing field, but we need to make sure that it's not based on size specifically so that it doesn't discourage and impede growth. And again, I want to make the point that we are still in a consultation process, so we're not clear on what our specific position as an organization will be because we represent our members and it's really critical that we speak for them. So we're going to be happy to share with all of you the specifics of our consultation as that becomes available. I will share a link with all of you and provide more feedback, but this is definitely going to have huge implications for the ecosystem as a whole if it's not done right and consultations and engagements aren't considered. So thank you for having me. Those are some of my main thoughts, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Melissa. It's very, very interesting to have the views from the startups, even if we understand that everything is not clear now because, of course, we don't know the regulation and there are various opinions within your members. So now let me turn to you, Emanuele. So the title of our roundtable is on investments in European tech promising companies. And of course, VCs are the key players in terms of investments in startups and in growing tech companies. Emanuele, you are also board member in France Digital, the main French startup association, and we had experience in analyzing the impact of previous regulation on tech companies and in particular on startups. So what are your views on the impact of the DMA on the tech ecosystem in Europe and on the investments in European tech promising companies? You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Laurent, and thanks a lot for your kind invitation. Thanks also to Sasha for this. I think that, as Melissa mentioned, we are living quite interesting times in the European VC ecosystem. We are seeing an acceleration which has been going on for at least 5-6 years in the euros that are invested in European startups, and we clearly see the emergence of some early European unicorns, or champions if you prefer. And as mentioned earlier on, this ecosystem still lacks probably of an exit market. So compared to the US or compared to Asia, European startups very often don't have a buyer, which is the end game for an investor like 360 Capital, for example. So it remains a clear weakness of our ecosystem. And when we talk about DMA and DSA and European legislation in general, which is something that needs to be improved, because let's keep everyone in mind that the European market is still the combination of 27 different markets. It is not a single European market. So the fact of making regulations more adapted to the reality is the basis to help European startups to become champions and to become capable of competing with other ecosystems. Once we have said that, and I agree that we still need to see what's in the DMA and DSA. Hopefully by tomorrow we'll have some material to look at more seriously. I think that, for example, it was mentioned earlier on by Pierre, the ex-ante obligations is kind of critical. At the same time, I'd like to remember everyone that if you are a startup today in Europe and you feel you are victim of unfair practices in very large platforms, there are 3 good reasons today for not doing anything regarding these unfair practices. First of all, the cost of going against a large platform, a gatekeeper, is very high. Secondly, process of getting, say, a binding decision by justice is very long, especially for a startup. And third, there's a real risk of retaliation from the same platforms if you go against them. So when I think about Google, for example, Google is a great company, has a 92% market share on search engines, and at the same time, it has some direct services such as G-Shopping and G-Travel. And I mean, it's quite normal to wonder, I mean, are they doing this direct services by exploiting the data that they have coming from the engine business? And very naturally, if you are an actor in travel or in e-commerce, you might wonder, yeah, but is this fair, unfair? I mean, where's the limit? So there are existing issues that need to be addressed. And so DMA probably is necessary if we want to seriously address this type of issues. As Pierre and Melissa said very correctly, it's not by a size criteria that we're gonna address correctly this type of issues, but still the issue exists. And I mean, my hope is that the European Commission will be able to, at some point, identify, even by discussing with startups that are quite heard in Europe these days, the best way to actually, say, put some rules on this on the use of data by these leading, say, gatekeepers. Because I think this is a real issue. It exists, everybody understands it, but no one is able to address it correctly. So that's a bit my view. Obviously, an investor, in principle, is against this type of legislation because, by the way, historically, the competition laws have been extremely problematic in terms of applications in Europe. But still, I think these times, I think it's worth it having a more serious look at what this DMA is trying to do, and maybe with the help of the different startups associations, and we can probably for once get some more fair rules on these topics.
Thank you very much, Emanuele. It's very clear, very interesting, and So let's have now a second round of intervention and the possibility for the three of you to react to the other interventions, perhaps triggered by one question on my side. So I will follow the same order and start by you, Pierre. So you mentioned in your intervention that you would be interested to conduct a survey and ask questions to VCs. And I believe also it's interesting for you to ask questions also to startups. So what question would you ask to them to assess if the DMA is negative or positive or neutral to them? And what key parameters would you look at in purity to see if this regulation hurts the ecosystem in Europe? So what would you ask to them to understand if there is a bad effect of the DMA? So my first question. But feel free to say what you want after.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. If I were a regulator, of course, I would ask but first, their strategy. What really are the key factors when they want to invest? And by the way, I will also ask myself, why do we have, although it's increasing, but why is the amount of investment so low compared to what it is in the US? And that's the first thing I would ask myself. Not only in the digital economy, by the way, but also in biotechnologies, for instance, because here we have also plenty of startups, but very few unicorns. So, and we know that part of the problem is we are not able to really promote a huge growth or a huge interest from VCs. So the first thing would be, what are the most important criteria, and compare this to how this criterion could be impacted by this new regulation. And I would look, although if I were a regulator, I would just look in parallel to users, because as I said, one of the most important problems is that we do not really think about the users themselves, whereas normally in competition law, that those are the people we have to protect. And here, looking at the investment on the one hand, but also looking at how do people use the platforms? When do they feel harmed? When do they feel cheated by the platforms? And what kind of benefit they get from the use of the platforms, being big or small, will be also a big question to me. Because without doing this, it's impossible to even understand whether a company is too big or not, and even on which kind of market does it operate. If users, for instance, we have done some very small experiment, but we observe that some people use Facebook or Amazon as search engines. If this is the case, and if a big part of the population is using these platforms as search engines, then you have a real competition between these platforms. And so if you try to prevent them to enter in this sector, or other platforms to enter in this specific sector, then you are harming the people. So I will, going back to your question, I will just have a very more in-depth look at these two things. What do users do, and how do they use the platform? What they expect from the platforms themselves? What kind of benefit they get? And on the other side, what are the most important factors for investors to invest? So then I will be able to distinguish within the regulation what is efficient or what is fair and what is too risky to be implemented today.
Thanks, Pierre. It's very clear, very clear. So I think there are a lot of possible cooperation between these three universities, VCs, startups, and economists to study the effect of this DMA. So, Melissa, I've listened to Emanuele, and he said that he gave one example of a gatekeeper, a large online platform that could be in competition with smaller, startups, smaller companies, and they can compete with each other in the same business. Is it the real reason why some of your members consider that there could be the DMA could be useful, or you see other reasons? And on the other side, can you give also some examples where really clearly large online platforms, gatekeepers, help the smaller companies to grow in the European tech ecosystem? Yes.
Great. And Pierre, I would love to work with you on a report on startups and VCs and the future of the DMA, and you too, Emanuele. That would be great for our members. So let's make sure we stay in touch to make that happen. I definitely think that there are examples on both sides of where platforms are harmful to ecosystem growth and where platforms are helpful to ecosystem growth. So in many ways, it's a double-edged sword. For instance, we've been seeing with COVID, some products are able to be delivered through Amazon much more easily. They can get to people. It's been thriving for that. Or some companies shared on the ecosystem platforms, like restaurants are using platforms like Grubhub to be able to deliver food during a crisis when they otherwise wouldn't be able to. But at the same time, it's very difficult to compete when you have the same product. Although I would counter that there's a statistic that shows, for instance, Google has flights that appear on their platform with Google Flights. But even when you search first in Google for flights, I think they only have about 0.5% of the market share for flights booked because the startups themselves are more innovative. So I agree that we absolutely need to do something to effectively change and regulate the larger tech players. But we need to be really very careful that it doesn't have a negative impact on that role that on the reliance startups have on platforms giving them access to users. So they would not maybe otherwise be able to attract a larger user base if they didn't appear in a search result, or they weren't using, as we mentioned before, Apple Wallet or e-wallet to be able to pay for services. So there's a balance that we really need to find. And I wanted to point out, because we were thinking about and talking about investment, yes, the EU is definitely behind the US, but the EU also got a later start in terms of opening up the world of venture capital investment. And right now, we're speeding up at the appropriate pace. So if we keep things moving at the way that they are, in 5 to 10 years, we will have potentially caught up with the US. But if we do too much to interfere with the ecosystem, we could see something else happening. So I think it's really important that we try to find a balance between regulating the larger tech companies while allowing startups to grow. And that's why we're going to be very careful about things like acquisitions, because as Emanuele pointed out, exits are a key critical part of what's missing in the European ecosystem against the US and Asia. I don't think it's necessarily investment itself. As I mentioned, that $40 billion number and growing, are we creating an environment where those investments can thrive and there are those exit opportunities? So I would love to continue to work with Pierre and Emanuele on getting perspective from the economists and VCs to make sure that we do make this regulation work for everyone in the best possible way. I think it's a good step that we're having these discussions ahead of most other global markets. I'll mention, by the way, the EU is always leading the charge in a good way in terms of creating necessary legislation that supports the consumer. We saw after the GDPR, for instance, that every country globally started to rush to how do we create a data legislation policy that will provide for our consumers. And I think we'll see the same thing with the DMA, which is another reason why, and we're already kind of seeing it, because in parallel with the DMA, the US Supreme Court has ordered Facebook to break up as a monopoly. So to me, Europe is really the epicenter of starting and leading these conversations around how do we regulate technology policy, which is why it's so critical that we're all involved in this conversation and working to get it right together.
Thanks, Melissa. And I've heard also that the UK also is creating a similar legislation like the DMA.
Yes, it comes out tomorrow, and I've heard some very interesting things.
Thanks, Melissa. So let me turn to you again, Emanuele. So I have two additional questions to you. So the first one is I've discussed with one of your colleagues who is also VC, and he told me that for him, one of the key factors now to invest is whether startups are benefiting from the COVID crisis or are suffering from it. So, and perhaps not only on that, so you think the DMA, so it comes in a very special moment, which is this crisis. It seems that the tech industry is really performing well, especially compared to other sectors. So do you think, so this crisis, the COVID crisis, can you link it regarding with the VC point of view, with this new regulation, is it too much? Then we have the crisis, we have a new regulation, and then it's too much. And second question is about exit and acquisitions. So one of the big exit for startups, for investment of VCs, is the acquisition by a very large online platform. Do you see the DMA as a potential threat for this kind of exit that you take into account, I believe, when you invest, that you like estimate that in 5-7 years, then the company you invest in can be bought by a big company?
On the first question regarding what's the impact of COVID on our ecosystem, it's true that probably, generally speaking, companies venture-backed are accelerating rather than suffering because of COVID. We have to keep this in mind with some clear exceptions. If you take companies in the travel industry, in the travel vertical, or companies in the, say, restoration, say, food vertical, for sure, they are suffering, and the fact of adding another, say, layer of legislation won't help them in particular. But I think overall, the real issue here is, let's have a look at what's in the regulation from tomorrow onwards. And let's try to understand whether this regulation manages to actually assess the real problems, which in my opinion exist regarding the gatekeepers and their power and some unfair practices, and is able to address specifically. So that's my point of view. On the second one regarding exits, I think what is missing, what our ecosystem is missing probably today, if we compare it to the US, is the public markets. Today, you don't have a real tech public market in Europe, with very few exceptions. And the most visible tech IPOs that happened in the last 24 months in Europe were on companies that were already profitable and fairly mature. And here, I think that the real problems comes from the lack of demand of this type of investment. So as, for example, the French government did, but I know there are other projects in Europe trying to bring long-term investors in European tech quoted stocks. And this is, in my opinion, the real challenge for the next 10 years is to have something emerging in the European markets, which will be, let's say, champions that will aggregate, once they are public, other tech companies. If you look at the Google, for example, I'm sorry, I'm speaking about Google all the time, and we're also using Google Meet tonight, but the reality is that if you look at Google 15 years ago, 16 years ago, when they went public, since the time they went public, they have acquired more than 200 companies down the road. And that's the way they have built the strategy. So what is really missing is similar companies capable of going public in Europe, and then that they can execute a build-up strategy. This will really change the way Europe can also compete with other ecosystems like US. And don't forget that we don't speak enough regarding the Asian ecosystems. And there you have very strong public markets. So I think what is really missing today is public markets.
Thanks, Emanuele. That's very, very useful. So the participants are a bit shy, so there is no questions in the chat. So perhaps to continue, I can ask you each of you a last question, except if there are questions from the audience. So we've heard about a lot about competition today, but also there is a big estimated impact of the DMA, which is on innovation. Do you think, and I think it's also in your paper, Pierre, you talk about innovation. Do you think this DMA can have an impact, perhaps a negative impact on innovation in Europe, direct or indirect effect, as perhaps some, there will be less investments in startups, less perhaps less clear perspectives for companies to grow. Do you think it can be a possible effect of the DMA?
Yeah, of course, for different reasons. But first, when you look at the major our research and development investors today, they are the GAFAs. The Amazon and Google trust the first two places, and Amazon is investing, in fact, as much as it's like 40% of the domestic research and development from France. So this is very huge. The reason they do that is just to provide some new services or to improve their services in order to keep their users. So of course, if you consider that any kind of strategy that will be efficient at capturing users or attracting some new users is something that will lead to a monopoly and then will just lead to fines for the companies, or even be a strategy that will be prevented by the regulator, then de facto you will stop innovation. So there is no reason to innovate if, in fact, when you are successful, you will be punished. So the direct impact on the big platforms is quite obvious. For the small ones, as I told you, and as Emanuele said, if there is no exit possible, and if you cannot by the end just reach a specific size due to innovation, then there is no need to innovate again. So of course, if you are not incentivized to grow, the incentive to innovate and to propose something new, to be able to compete with the already big platform, is something that is not interesting anymore. It's not profitable. So by definition, in this kind of ecosystem that is really driven by innovation, it might be innovation on how to use the data, but it also might be a direct innovation for the consumers, new tools, new services, new interactions between different platforms, inventing a new segment on the market. All these things may be detrimental with the regulation that is too stringent or that is too blind, and that is in fact targeting everyone at the same time. So here the indirect impact is, although we know that our regulators are trying to regulate the big platforms, in fact, they will also reduce the innovation for the small ones. And the third thing is, because they do not want big platforms to buy some new startups or new potential unicorns, of course, then there is no reason for them to help some startups to finance them, to buy, to try to buy new ones, or to just be a part of some new project that will be innovative. So for the three reasons, this kind of very strong regulation that is imposed quite blindly is, to me, a real risk for innovation. And as Emanuele said, there is something we forget. Even our regulators, most of the time, they talk about the GAFA, and they try to make a thing or to say implicitly, although we want to have a global regulation, we are targeting the big ones, do not worry. But they never mention the BATEX, the Asian platforms, which is very bizarre because and here we go beyond economics, but they just seem to think that they will be able to bargain with American companies, and so at some point to find an agreement, but they never think about how difficult it will be to do the same with the Chinese platforms. So here, there is another problem. We will just potentially, or it's likely that we will reduce the level of innovation here, that we won't have as incentives to innovate that we used to. And at the same time, we know that we will have some difficulty to implement this very stringent regulation and norms to the Asian platform, which is very bizarre again to me, because of course we do not want to bargain with companies. We want to show that politics is more powerful than economics, and so our regulators, when they act on our behalf, they should normally be able to implement some specific regulation to companies. But we do that in only one way. We think only about the US, and we never think about how dangerous it will be with Chinese companies. I do not know what regulators will do if, for instance, Chinese companies do not comply with our norms. So, and if we do not think about this either, then we will have a problem with innovation, but also we'll have another problem because we will just slow down the activity of the big American companies, reduce the growth of our own European startups, but we will let the Chinese companies do whatever they want. So here, to me, again, it's not economic, but there is a political problem here.
Thank you, Pierre. Very interesting points about the competition by the Chinese tech giants. Very, very relevant. Melissa, so perhaps I would like to ask you the same question about your assessment of the potential impact of the DMA on innovation. And in fact, I would like also to ask you a second question, the same that I asked to Emanuele, about the effect of the crisis on startups. I'm curious, it's not in the center of our debate today, but you probably know. And has it a big impact on European startups, this COVID crisis? Yes, please.
Great, thank you. And thanks again for having me be a part of this great discussion on the DMA, which will have huge implications for the ecosystem as a whole, both in Europe and I believe globally. And to get to the point of the question about innovation, any sort of regulatory framework that discourages startups from growing is going to have a negative impact on innovation. In the same way that over the last 10 years, we've seen more and more recent graduates of schools like École Polytechnique rushing to start their own company rather than joining a consulting company like BCG, which was traditionally exactly where you wanted to be. That's a new thing that's happened because entrepreneurs see an opportunity in creating something that can scale and change the world and grow, and it's exciting. And if you know going into a project that you can only get to level 5 when you're trying to get to level 200, you're not going to spend all the time and energy to do that. You're just going to take a job at a company like Google, for instance, as opposed to going out and creating something amazing on your own. So if you're doing anything to disincentivize the opportunity to scale and grow, then you're going to disincentivize innovation. So I would be very careful with whatever policy comes forward to make sure that we still leave space for entrepreneurs and startups to grow and scale, and we don't discourage growth in the European ecosystem, because that's the opposite of what we want to see. We want to see more EU unicorns. We want to see more scale-ups. We want to see more companies that can compete with the Googles and the Facebooks at the European level. And of course, obviously with what's at stake at the Asian ecosystem globally as well, because we have more and more players who are knocking on the doors across the world from Asia to say, we have that same product, but it's better and more fun. And so we need to be really mindful of that. And to your point about the impact of COVID on startups in Europe, this is an unprecedented time, and it's been difficult for certain verticals. As Emanuele pointed out, I would agree completely. Travel startups are seeing a very difficult road forward, as are restaurants and other food service industry companies. But at the same time, we've also seen incredible innovation as a result of this crisis. We've watched entrepreneurs pivot. Clothing producers have started to make PPE and masks. Telemedicine and e-health is on a huge rise. We have a digital health fellow at Allied for Startups who has been tracking for us how much we have seen growth in the e-health space. We've also seen, for the first time pretty much ever in the entire world, every single person who has any intelligence in the health and vaccine space coming together to work on the same problem and actually sharing information, which has been incredible to see what kind of power can be unleashed when, rather than competing with each other to first create the product, we're really working together to solve our most pressing problems. So for me, I really hope that the pandemic has shown light on that innovation can solve some of those problems, and entrepreneurs can be part of more than just making money, because there's absolutely a role of business to make money, but there's also the opportunity for businesses to be solving those problems. And I think as we're faced with questions of what will global markets look like and how do we regulate and compete at this level, more and more people are questioning, what is the traditional model of capitalism, and is it working for us? And is it perhaps better for businesses to have a role in solving the problems? And I think we've seen that startups and entrepreneurs and the next generation of leaders are really wanting to see more of that. So I think we'll come out of the pandemic with many lessons learned. I think we've seen some new innovations created, and I'm really really happy to see, especially things like what the French government has done to truly support its ecosystem, really been a leader globally in terms of the packages that you've created to support your startups and companies here. So we at Allied for Startups have a COVID-19 working group, and we have 13 policy recommendations for COVID recovery, which we're happy to share, that we developed in partnership with many of our member associations in the wake of the crisis, and a lot of governments have taken up those recommendations. So I'm very optimistic about the future of the digital ecosystem in Europe and beyond, and also about the future of entrepreneurship and working together to solve some of our bigger problems.
Thanks, Melissa. Emanuele, so another question came to my mind is, do you think that there could be a shift between regions for some projects or investments because of this DMA? So, okay, I understand you're European VC, so you invest in Europe, you're based in Europe, but I'm sure that VC industry is global and that you can also look at, or your colleagues can look at projects outside of Europe, and also entrepreneurs now they can choose to be based in France, Italy, or in the US or in Asia. So do you foresee such kind of shifts or trade, or like at least entrepreneurs thinking of be based outside of Europe because of this new regulation?
Maybe I'm a bit optimistic regarding the implication of the DMA, but let me say one thing. Especially right now, at this moment, we see more and more interesting projects coming to the market and looking for funding, where we combine, and this is indirectly also probably a result of the COVID crisis, where you combining science and tech. And that's very interesting because it's not pure digital play. And Europe has a chance on this type of project. If you look at the AI and the way AI has been financed in Europe, I think you have a point to say. You can say probably there will be a space for European champions. I think we have to accept as an ecosystem, and I've been doing this job for more than 20 years, so I know exactly where we were 20 years ago. We are becoming central in the economy. And so the politics, and we have to live with the fact that governments and policymakers want to understand how our market works and want to a certain extent impose rules. So I think we have to live with this. It's part of the fact that we are a more mature market. 20 years ago, when the internet bubble bursted, people said there was the real economy and the new economy. Now nobody is doing this split. It's obvious for everyone that e-commerce players are part of the real economy. Logistic players are next generation logistic players are part of this new of the economy. Full stop. There's no separation. So I remember when talking about regulation, when in France we had this regulation regarding foreign investments in startups, which created a lot of buzz at some point. At the end, I think through the work that has been done also with France Digital, we managed to have a decent discussion with the policymakers. And I think that law actually obviously adds some constraints when you want to sell a business, but still there's a process and you have to live with the process. You cannot just, if you have an AI investment and which is strategic for the country, it's normal that you have to talk to Bercy. You cannot just say, okay, I'm an investor. It would be easier for me as an investor to tell you, I want to sell this business to whoever wants to buy this, but it doesn't work like that. When you are central to the economy, and you can see that we are central because there is a lot of public money flowing into our ecosystem, then you have to make arbitrage. I'm not saying I'm happy that DMA is coming, but I think as a matter of fact, it's part of the life of a mature ecosystem now. That's my view.
Thanks for the very pragmatic answer. And okay, we have no questions, so I think your interventions were super clear. Oh, there is one question for Yazar. I will read it to you. So it's a question for Emanuele. do you think the DMA can help solve the issue of kill zones, that there are less and less startups willing to challenge the core businesses of gatekeepers? Question for you.
I mean, if we think about search engines, I'm trying to interpret this question, but I mean, let's take search engines. Is the DMA is gonna solve the fact that we have 92% of search engines made by Google? No, that's not the issue. The issue is, I think the issue of the DMA, but that's my personal understanding, and we're still talking based on leaks on this. So I think I would be pretty cautious on this, but the thing is, DMA will probably try to address something which is important, which has to do with unfair practices by exploiting data. So the thing is not, are we going to have a competitor to Google coming from Europe? I don't think that's the point. The point is, can we probably have a clearer set of rules of what Google can do with the available data that is collected through its core business, which is the search engine business, vis-a-vis its customers, so people making advertising on Google, and vis-a-vis the other businesses done by Google, such as G Shopping and G Travel. That would be a good news, in my opinion. That would be very good news. If we manage to address this, it would be super. But no, I don't think that this is going to open up again the possibility of having a European search engine. I mean, I don't even feel the need. Yeah, quantum is a different story. I agree with Antoine, who's there. I'm sorry, I took it.
Okay, thanks, Emanuele.
I know if it's quant, I'm sorry. You were talking about quant. I'm sorry. Yeah, but quant exists. I don't think that we want to make quant successful through a DMA. This is not the way startups work, in my opinion.
Okay, very good, very good. So, if you wish, each of you can say a final word to conclude. Okay, Antoine said, do they even have a chance to compete? So, okay, so let's keep the same order. So, Pierre, if you want to say a final word to conclude, yes, 2 or 3 sentences, and then each of you can conclude. Yes, Pierre.
Yeah, so to conclude, as you have noticed, I'm really skeptical about the any positive impacts of this regulation. So I think, although it's a bit late now, but we have to look very cautiously about the regulation, everything that is written and what is the spirit of what is written to be able to just have some red flags and explain to the regulators when it seems that they do not really understand what are the risks, what are the most important risks for the digital ecosystem in Europe. I think we all agree on the fact that we want to have more competition. We want to have fair practices, and we want to reduce uncertainty about what platforms and what any companies can do. So we want to have a good level playing field that will be the same for everyone, that will be perfect or as perfect as possible. But we have to be careful here because in my opinion, and again, this is just my opinion, I'll have more certainty tomorrow. But when you look at what is written, you have the feeling that our regulators today are aiming at just pursuing different goals at the same time with the same regulation. And this is not good. We should have one regulation to just satisfy one need or to just solve one problem, but not everything at the same time. When we had the chance to talk with some French regulators about this topic, they were considering that it's good to regulate big platforms because they are big, because they are in a monopoly, because they want to promote European startups, but also because they represent a political threat and they can influence a political election. So if this is the problem, then we have to regulate them in another way. But we cannot hope to just solve the fake news issues or any kind of conspiracy theory that just are spreading on social networks in trying to impose the DMA, for instance. So we have to be very clear on what we want to do, what are our aims and goals, and then look at what are the potential side effects. So in my opinion, and that's my conclusion, it's really time to have a proper economic and law-economic analysis of the regulation to just explain to our regulators that there may be some risks with what they have done. So they should rephrase or rethink part of the regulation to improve it.
Thanks, Pierre. Melissa, do you want to say a conclusion also?
Sure. Again, thank you very much for having me and for convening the conversation around DMA. And I will say we don't yet know what the final framework will look like. So we're all sort of speaking, just assuming from the leaks that we have seen. So perhaps tomorrow everything will have changed and none of what we've said will be relevant, but I don't expect that to be the case. And I do expect that there will be pieces of the DMA that make our members nervous and pieces that make them very happy. And normally when there is a fair compromise, that's a sign of a good policy. And so I think that there's a lot to be optimistic about, in that it's high time that we have a conversation around the Digital Services Act and the DMA and what that will mean for our ecosystem. But I would continue to stress the importance of never discouraging startups from scaling and from growth, because that's a really negative place to start with your policy legislation. I understand that there is deep concern about the big tech players and the implications that platforms have for opportunities as a whole in the ecosystem. But we need to be really important and listen to players like France Digital, for instance, and make clear consultations from startups so that they have an opportunity. And we need a competition policy that is clear and that solves the problems it's asked to solve, as Pierre pointed out, and that makes it easy for investors like Emanuele to know what the implications of their investment will be 5 or 10 years down the road. So I'm very hopeful about this process. I'm still waiting to hear from all of our members to see what direction we will take in terms of pursuing a DMA that works for startups in the European ecosystem. And I look forward to seeing what the Commission comes out with tomorrow and doing a more full assessment. And absolutely we'll be continuing the conversation and looking at what it could mean in terms of innovation and what it will mean for growth in ecosystems in Europe. So thanks again for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Melissa. Same for us. Emanuele, you want to say a word of conclusion?
I've said a lot of things. So what I would conclude by saying simply that let's hope that we will be able to have a constructive discussion with the policymakers regarding this new pack of legislation that are very, very important for our ecosystem. So that's, I mean, I'm relatively optimistic because I think that the attitude of, say, public powers and policymakers vis-a-vis the ecosystem has changed quite dramatically. And I think that we have the possibility of explaining things and explaining how things work. But I mean, let's see.
Thanks, Emanuele. Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, Pierre, for a great debate. I will use the word of conclusion by Bertrand Lépinois, thanks to this bunch of brilliant speakers. That's true. So we look forward to the release of the DMA tomorrow. We'll look at the Commission's website and see what's in it. So thank you to all of you, to the participants also for having listening to this debate. And have a good evening and see you soon. So bye-bye. Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.